come on, I still want my students to like me. If I had the choice, I'd rather that they like me than that they don't like me.
Yeah.
But how many of my moves in the classroom then are driven by wanting people to have a high opinion of me? Welcome to Hallway Conversations. We're a trio of educators who have plenty of questions about teaching and learning and school culture, and we believe in the value of collaboration and reflection as we seek to keep growing as teachers. So this podcast is our place for thinking out loud together about issues in education and why they might matter to Christian educators. Welcome to the conversation.
Hello everyone, welcome to Hallway Conversations. My name's Matt Beamers.
And I'm Dave Mulder.
I'm Abby DeGroat.
As always, we want to thank you for allowing the three of us to be here with you. And we want to thank you for joining us in the hallway. Each week, one of us brings a question. We try to think creatively around it in the context of Christian education. We're good friends who love each other and love engaging each other in conversation about our practice. And our deep hope is that you are enriched and encouraged in your own work and maybe even in your everyday walking around life. Well, we have a long list of topics we want to talk about. We want to know what hallway conversations you'd like to hear. So if you have ideas or questions or feedback about this broadcast or any other ones, or you simply want to share your own hallway conversations with us, please email us at hallwayconvospod@gmail.com, hallwayconvospod@gmail.com. In fact, today's question isn't coming from us, it's coming from one of our listeners. So we want to thank John, a listener and middle school teacher in California, for submitting this question, and we encourage you to maybe do the same. But here's John's question for us.
Hi there, hallway guys. I'm John, and I am a 6th grade teacher in Southern California. I would love to hear you guys talk about reputations. How are we to deal with reputations as teachers? For a teacher that has a good reputation, is it acceptable for them to lean into that, take more risks because they have more grace built up with parents and with students? What about a teacher with a bad reputation? How much effort should go into correcting that or fixing that? I know we shouldn't worry too much about what people think about us, but I think your reputation can be an advantage and also a disadvantage in teaching. Thanks, guys. Keep up the good work.
Thanks, John, for that question. That has left me really actually wrestling quite a bit, and I find it's actually a very complicated question. Abby, as I hear this, I can't help but think this is a complicated question, so sorry to start with you, but I'm just wondering sort of what are your initial musings about this question?
Yeah, I've always been uneasy in the presence of people casually talking about or scrutinizing teacher actions, right?
Yeah.
So in a casual gathering, if someone mentions, the high school I used to work at, a teacher there, something that they're doing in a class, and negatively, I tend to get defensive because I think that's one slice of time, that's one perspective, and I know reputations do have an impact. I think John is exactly right. I think that's true, that reputations impact teachers and have an effect on our work. But I also think it's important for us to name that I think it's also a broken way to look at teacher-student interactions, teacher-parent interactions, because I think sometimes it can be taken out of context. It can be a small slice. It's not a holistic look at what a teacher's practice genuinely looks like.
In the sense, there's more to the story?
There's more to the story, and students are not experts in pedagogy and education, and so I wonder if that's a fair rubric.
Right, if parents are the ones coming saying, well, I heard this happened, and does that...
As a professional educator, that bothers me.
You're right.
Yeah, the word itself leaves me a bit uneasy. Not because I don't want to be naive about it.
Right.
Of course those reputations exist.
Yes.
But I think you're right, is that how do people arrive at this sort of this declarative statement about a teaching professional that we know little about and yet are often spoken about in very definitive terms when very little is known. I think that's super helpful, Abby. So thanks for naming that tension. Dave, how about for you? Like, do you feel the tension, or what's going through your head as you hear John's a question that's way more complicated, I think, than I first thought.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate the way that he wrapped that up, talking like, is this something we should worry about? And I think that's the right. I think that's the right thing for us to ask about, right? And I guess I'm looking at this through the lens of my own experiences, right? And I think back to when I was a novice teacher, and I'll just say it, I really wanted my students to like me. And that, I think, is very much driven by reputation. Come on, I still want my students to like me. If I had the choice, I'd rather that they like me than that they don't like me. But, yeah, like how many of my moves in the classroom then are driven by wanting people to have a high opinion of me, and that I want a good reputation. I want parents to be talking good about me. And I mean, the dark side of that is I kind of have cultivated a sense of that, I think, for myself. Right? I've joked before on the show, I'm an Enneagram 3, right? I'm the achiever, and I'm very image conscious. I'm very aware of what people think about me, or I'm always trying to perceive what people think about me. So, yeah, that sometimes means then I'm going to try to curry goodwill with my students and with their parents. And is there a dark side to that? You bet there is. Like, I have to check that impulse in myself, right? But the flip side of that is, I think John in his question is right? Like, I was more willing to take some risks pedagogically in my teaching practice because of being like, feeling like I could get away with something. That's a gross way of saying it.
Yeah, Dave, can I just follow up that? Yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's good.
But this idea of like to get away, like as you're talking about pedagogy, to get away with, that feels ambiguous to me. So I'm just wondering, can you clarify when you're talking about the phrase, "Hey, I can get away with something"? Yeah, can you just talk about that or clarify that?
Yeah, and that's why, like, immediately after I said get away with, that sounds gross. I don't mean anything insidious or like unprofessional or inappropriate. Like, I guess what I'm thinking more of. Because I had curried enough favor with parents and students, like they can just kind of like, oh, well, that's just Mulder in the sense.
Do things that are untraditional.
Yes, thank you. Abby.
Yes. Out of the box.
Out of the box, right?
Yes.
So, like, I really like Rick Wormley a lot. Some of his writing, and he had a great bit where he talks about committing to daring acts of pedagogy, right? And I like that idea a lot, and I've tried to embody that, right? But to be daring in your pedagogy. That might be things that are non-traditional, things that might seem a little risky to colleagues who maybe worry more about how they're perceived. And because I've developed enough of a sense of like, oh, parents trust me, I don't know. I don't know.
But I'm coming back as you're talking, Dave, right now. Like you have mentioned before, we both have mentioned in previous podcasts, this idea of we teach who we are.
Oh, yes.
Right? So I can't be Dave Mulder for all kinds of reasons. I don't want to be Dave. No. So how do you? So maybe for someone it doesn't come. For you, daring acts of pedagogy comes very like that is who you are.
Right.
But we've all taught, or at least I have taught next to people who have these amazing reputations. And I see who they are and what they do, and there's part of me that I can sometimes feel defeated in terms of like, well, I can't be that. Right.
Very much so. And when you're a new teacher or someone coming in, that can be very hard to teach next door to, right? For instance, to be comparing your reputation for good or for worse to people in the building.
And that can do harm. That can be harmful.
Yeah, it can be demoralizing.
It can be demoralizing, right? And so that's why it's interesting to think about that. Like in a school where there's 3 or 4 or 5 teachers who have sort of have this wonderful reputation. What might that do to the rest? Like, do we just let them fly and be themselves? And that for me is a bit of the challenge of thinking like, hey, if I'm a school leader and I see Dave Mulder, is this a matter of, hey, that's Dave being Dave and that's awesome, and now look at that, like he's earned his trust and he thinks outside of the box? And I guess my question is, how do I not just necessarily, like John saying, like, can I use that, like, to take risks in the classroom? My question is, how do I leverage that with the rest of the staff, actually? Like for me, the question isn't about, hey, like, how do I leverage Dave's reputation, not just in the community? How do I leverage it with staff? Right. Not to give them a better reputation, but how do I leverage that to help them be better teachers?
And that, I think, is the key question, right?
Yes.
That it shouldn't be about an individual teacher's reputation. It shouldn't be. This is a real thing. I'm so glad you said that, Abby, because it is. This is a real, it's something that we need to grapple with. But this is the broken nature of it, right? Like, if there's this culture of competition among the teachers, if there's this culture of, I'm going to hoard all my pedagogical tricks and I'm not going to share that with anybody else, right? And I guess that would be my response to it, I think, for school leaders to set up ways to, like, so let's get us into each other's classrooms, and not in a comparative way, but in a coaching kind of a way, right? Like, so that you can see your colleagues at work and say, oh, now I see that I could do that.
Right.
I've never thought about that before.
Well, and that I might bring something that students need that could, even though your reputation is already stellar, right, could really serve your students well. I was part of a collaborative professional development. We set up PLCs, right, professional learning communities, inside our school, and that was, I think, the best part of that model. Is that, I would bring an English lesson, and the science teacher, who that wasn't his natural language, right, would have such great insight for me about students who aren't great at English, and he would ask clarifying questions of me that I didn't even think of because it's so much my natural language. Right? And so that's just a great way to build strength and camaraderie and collaborativeness among a faculty, which is what you want.
Right.
Yeah, like I can remember being at a conference and hearing a speaker once say that part of the responsibility of leadership is to hold teachers accountable to the knowledge that they have within them. And I think about that in terms of pedagogy, to hold teachers accountable to the pedagogical to the pedagogy they have with them to share for the sake of students and other teachers, right? So that's why I like that idea of leveraging that within the school for the sake of students. It's interesting, as you were talking, I was thinking about John's question, because he used the phrase, hey, should we lean into this? For teachers who have good reputations, should we lean into this? Or should there be more grace? And I'm just thinking about that idea of, like, leaning into your... I don't know if you should lean into your reputation. What we need to lean into is good teaching and good learning.
Yes.
And not because of a reputation, but because the question is like, what's, in my mind anyways, it's what's best for kids. Don't do it because, as you're thinking about pedagogy, is to say, well, because then I think it can lead to arrogance, to be honest. Look at me, I've got this reputation. I can take these risks. People trust me. And in fact, there's something that I think unhealthy about that in some ways.
Sure.
Right.
But if we're thinking about this in terms of, like, hey, what is good pedagogy? What is good learning? What is sound practices around that? I think that's how you either enhance a positive reputation, or it's how you build a reputation.
And yeah, I could do things that would get me a great reputation with 8th grade students that should not be done.
Correct.
Totally.
Pedagogically, that I don't want teachers doing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
From an educational standpoint. And so I think realizing too that we're dealing with students and parents who are not trained educators. And so their lens is going to be different.
Right.
And so you could have a reputation, for giving class parties or for bringing treats, right? I don't know that I want that to be the basis of your educational strategy.
Which comes back to, right, how are these reputations arrived at? Like, I can imagine that there are teachers who pour so much into their pedagogy, into their lesson learning, like all of it, and have a very rigorous classroom, and they love their kids, but the reputation is that they're less fun, so to speak, right? And yet I'd want my children in that class, right? Because you know that there's going to be a level of care, but there's also going to be a level of learning. So maybe in having, this, whatever that positive reputation is, maybe it's a bit of careful what you wish for, right? Like whether it's, and I sometimes think, no one's reputation is as good as people think it is, and no one's as bad as overall. And that's painting with a wide brush, because we arrive at conclusions about teachers without knowing the whole story.
That's right. And to recognize that there's a bigger picture, that we're only seeing a slice of it. Right? And I guess I'm thinking about the difference between reputation and legacy.
Yeah, you've mentioned that before, Dave. I was actually, can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So the short version, I didn't come up with this myself. This comes from a Bible lesson I used to teach. I was a middle school Bible teacher, and we were looking at Israel and Judah's kings and talking about it in terms of reputation and legacy, right? That a lot of these really bad kings, that some of them were bad kings, so often they were doing what was the politically expedient thing because they were concerned about their reputation, their standing with the people. And the really good kings, your King David and your Josiah and Jehoshaphat and Hezekiah, they were good kings because they were so faithfully relying on the Lord. It was thinking much more in terms of the long-term legacy that they had and the broader impact they have on all the people, right? So anyway, to make the analogy here for us as teachers, and I think for school leaders in particular, to say we're going to care, we're going to be more about the long-term legacy of what our school does to impact students than the individual reputations of teachers on a day-to-day basis, right? And so to foster that kind of a culture that has that long view of saying this is what we're about. We are going to faithfully rely on Jesus. We are going to have these opportunities for faith formation for our students. We're going to have the opportunities to unpack curriculum in ways that are going to shape who our students become. We're going to choose pedagogies. Maybe it is daring acts of pedagogy, but with that long view in mind. Not
and the students are going to have a variety of teachers that are going to meet them in different places, right? So it's not about how much you love one teacher at one point in time, but it's about how each teacher in this building is bringing something to the table for this student.
So let's just say there's a student who maybe that we just taught that just graduated that's heading into their first job. What advice would you give them around how much should I care about my reputation? What would you say to them? And then how do you enter into a new community where no one knows you? You're moving to a place you've never lived, or maybe you're moving to a place where you're actually well known and
for good or ill.
Yeah, for good or ill. Let's be honest about that, right? And what advice would you give them in terms of hey, how do I go about building trust? And because I was going to say, how do I go about building a good reputation? But should that even be important versus how do I go about building trust? What advice would you give to a first year, or even maybe a veteran teacher who's sort of reevaluating some of this and is maybe I want to make some changes here. What would you say?
Yeah, I have a C.S. Lewis quote that I love, right? He says, aim at heaven and you'll get earth thrown in, aim at earth and you get neither. Right? So I think
interesting.
I think aiming for reputation, right, you might miss them both. But if your aim is good teaching and small, being faithful in those small things, right? So setting a good foundation with your students. It's not, I tell my education students all the time because I teach applied ed psych to future teachers who will teach middle school and high school students. And I always tell them, I said, you have to know who you are. And if you are building your image of yourself on what adolescents think of you or say to you on a day-to-day basis, you're going to be miserable. There is not a worse scenario that I can think of than for a young teacher to build their self-image on what adolescent students think. That's a recipe for disaster. You have to have a foundation with the Lord. You have to have a foundation of who you are as a person, and then I think you just build strategically from there.
I think my word of advice would be to get enmeshed in that community. So in a couple ways, get connected with your colleagues. If you are getting started in your teaching career, leverage your learning networks that you were talking about here too, Abby, right? Like find ways to connect with teachers. Think out loud with your colleagues about your curriculum, about things that you're trying in your teaching practice. Try to get maybe that kind of 360 view of, so what would happen if, you know? And if we're going to, do some adventurous pedagogical moves here, to have an experienced colleague come alongside you and plan that out. And
how might that play out? What might happen?
Yeah. And for school leaders too, I think that's a good thing to just really walk alongside those novice teachers especially, but for experienced teachers as well. And then, to get to know your community, get to your students' events, get to know them beyond the classroom as well, so that you see them as whole people. And honestly, I think a lot of times parents really respect that too, when they see that you're there for their kids beyond just what's happening in the classroom. And I know we're all busy people. For us as educators too, I want to be cautious about advising you to do more things, right? Yeah. But this is one where the investment of time, I think, does have a payoff for a trusting relationship.
Yeah, it makes me think of just the hard work of knowing others and also being known, like being out there and getting to know the people in your community. And that's one way you build trust is through relationship and through good pedagogy, and to know that you don't have to do it alone, actually, that there's people, school leaders and colleagues, that if you're teaching across the hall from a Dave Mulder and an Abby DeGroot, that your success is tied to that. Like, we're in this together.
And resist the urge to shut the door, right?
Yes. Resist the urge to shut the door.
As hard as it is to have other people, to invite others in, it makes you so much better and opens the door to much more collaboration and transparency.
And maybe even a little bit of what we're trying to do here, right? These hallway conversations, to have real conversations with colleagues about hard stuff too, stuff that matters.
Stuff that matters, absolutely. Friends, we know that your time is valuable, and we want to thank you for joining us today for another complicated and complex hallway conversation.
Great question.
We want to thank John for the tough question and the wrestling that it's caused us, and I know we'll continue to wrestle through this. And whether it's this day, this week, this month, or this school year, we hope that the Lord gives you what you stand in need of. We want to thank you for the good, God-delighting work that each of you are doing in your schools and communities. And as you go into this week, on behalf of Abby and Dave, we just want to say that, to bless you and say that the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace and give you peace and give you peace. Amen. Have a good week, everyone. Thank you.
This podcast was quite literally dreamed up during one of our actual hallway conversations. Our music is by Ethan Mulder. Hallway Conversations is an independent podcast created and produced by Matt Beamers, Abby DeGroat, and Dave Mulder. Thanks for listening.